Hey guys, just pulled a Sargon of a card. Just the what is going on? Yeah, fucking. Oh my god, I'm so tempted to just start the stream again. That's so frustrating. Every time I mute the mic so we're not talking over the intro, I always forget to unmute them. But I should be back. Tom of a card. Someone's already pointed it out. Anyway, guys, how y'all doing? Welcome back to another live stream with your boy Dick Dickinson. Today we are going to be talking about Oswald Spengler's On Prussianism and Socialism, with sound actually. And we got one super chat already, which I'll just read out by Dylan Fritz. Wanted to send some dough your way. Great work, Tom. $4. Thank you very much, man. Greatly appreciate it, and I greatly appreciate the same name. My name is Dylan as well, and it's, as I said when the sound was off, Dylan Army Unite. Anyway, we are back with Dick. How you going, Dick?
Yeah, not too bad.
So,
How's everybody else?
I prefaced this back when there was no sound, the good old days of no sound, when I said, today's essay that we were going to look at, I actually only just read today for the first time. It's an 80-page work by Oswald Spengler, and I only just read it just now, so I'm a little bit underprepared. So tonight we're going to have a lot of Dick in the stream, because he is much more equipped to speak about this essay than I am. So do you want to do some little introductory words? What's the significance of this essay to you? Like firstly, it should be said that the essay is based on some notes that Spengler had taken for the second volume of The Decline of the West, which my last video was on. That kind of looked at a lot of these introductory ideas to his first volume of Decline of the West. So a lot of the things we'll be talking about tonight will be playing off that. But one of the bigger focuses of the essay is Spengler's distinction between not only German socialism and other brands of it, but also just the different kind of mythologies of modern politics from the 17th century onwards. So, did you want to do a little introductory to this essay?
Yeah, sure. So, to put it into context, it was written just after World War One, and Spengler was a very proud German, so he was kind of pissed off with losing and the events of the German Revolution. But I think to fully appreciate this essay, we have to put it into the context of Spengler's whole system, which he kind of outlines in The Decline of the West, where he kind of develops a new way of thinking about history. Dylan made a video recently on this topic. He kind of rejects the kind of traditional interpretation of history of just being classical, medieval, modern, and instead builds this model of civilizations as superorganisms. And so he sees throughout history the appearance of 8 high civilizations. Off the top of my head, they are the Mesopotamian, the Indian, the Chinese, the Mesoamerican, the Greco-Roman, the Egyptian, the Magian, which was the Middle Ages, like the time of Zoroastrians, Christians, and Muslims and Jews, and the modern, which he refers to as Faustian, which began around 100 AD or so. And he breaks, he inverts on his conception of history in this way, because he sees this kind of traditional linear model as non-dynamic. He sees history as a living thing, that civilizations emerge as living beings, and to kind of create this kind of deterministic, causal, linear model is kind of taking away the kind of life out of our analysis and kind of positing these civilizations as kind of dead objects of study. And so you have to get your head around this idea of civilizations as superorganisms. Now, he kind of transposes this idea of metamorphosis from Goethe's understanding of plant organisms onto civilizations as kind of like a metaphor or an analogy. And he breaks down the cycle of civilizations into 2 categories. I mean, two modes. The initial mode being what he calls the culture phase, and the subsequent mode being what he calls the civilization phase. And so in the culture phase, what occurs is that a group of people in a specific geographical area develop a unique religious orientation. Uh, and through the generation of this kind of religious orientation, they developed their own art forms, their own perspective on the world, and their own unique world feeling that gets represented in their architecture and their philosophy and their ways of doing life. Um, and this eventually reaches a zenith point where it crystallizes and no longer continues this kind of free form cultural progress, and instead kind of crystallizes into a consistent structure which becomes its civilizational manifestation. And instead of expanding metaphysically toward a self understanding and a unique world feeling and a unique religious orientation, what occurs instead is a material expansion outwards to then use those ideas to then dominate over the material plane and generate an expansive civilization, which over time he maps out very consistently. 8 different civilizations in world history have gone through this process roughly around the same time frame, and then crystallized into civilizations and then withered away and decayed. Um, and so we have to explain this context because he describes in this essay the kind of permutations of Faustian civilization, which is our civilization, and he kind of describes the kind of historical growth of the various sub-ethnicities within our civilization and the different kind of leading countries of Western Europe and the different sub-mentalities of the Faustian mentality that they each embody. So he describes essentially that the English and the Germans, at his time of writing in the early 20th century, this became apparent, were the kind of leading forces of the civilizational shift in Faustian civilization, which he posited to have occurred around the end of the 18th century. And so he kind of viewed the Anglo-Saxons and the Germans as, well, and we know that they are essentially one race, the Germanic race, but nevertheless they had kind of 2 distinct representations of the same kind of racial feeling. And he analogized the English with the spirit of the Vikings and the Germans with the spirit of the medieval knights. And so this is where he kind of draws his kind of concept of what Prussianism means versus what kind of an English worldview is. And he creates this contradistinction between socialism and capitalism, which obviously he attributes capitalism to the English ideal and socialism to the German ideal. And the way that he uses socialism is not the same way that we use socialism today in common vernacular, but instead it's a lot more fascistic. He describes how the socialist ideal of the Prussian is essentially inherited from the medieval knights as constructing a hierarchical society based upon command and obedience and duty, where the individual ascends the hierarchy of his society not by simply generating more wealth than his counterparts, but instead by integrating himself into the command hierarchy of his state. And that the ideal of the German is to rise these different levels to the higher echelons of the state hierarchy, being the military or other aspects of the civil service. And so the kind of German ideal, moral ideals and cultural ideals get manifested through the state, whereas he sees the English ideal as being this kind of Viking ideal of seeing the world in terms of booty and plunder, instead of the kind of German ideal of to express order and structure. And so while the kind of German sees nature as this orderly, abstract, spiritual context, you see this in German philosophy, particularly in the 19th century, with people like Hegel and Goethe, who conceive of the world as there being like this kind of spiritual essence to history and a spiritual essence to the structure of government and the structure of
You could
economics.
also use Kant as another example with the deontological as opposed to utilitarian ethic that emphasizes duty as opposed to like personal happiness and success.
Yeah, exactly. These are all manifestations of the kind of Prussian spirit, as opposed to the English spirit, which we see in Enlightenment rationalism, scientific empiricism, viewing the world as nature as a kind of chaotic structure, or economics as chaotic, or the Darwinian world picture, or the capitalist world picture of there being these kind of chaotic fluctuations that can be harnessed and for individual benefit.
Mm.
And so there's these two different views. He sees that the world is essentially has succumbed to the Faustian global dominance, with the possible exception of kind of holdout in kind of the Islamic world and maybe Russia, and that he envisaged that the Prussian ideal and the English ideal would have to fight it out in the real world, in the material plane. That there was no like right or wrong in terms that could be argued for with metaphysics, but simply with the sword and with blood would be the only way to settle this contradiction. And so he sees the English as trying to create a global marketplace, which the capitalist English businessman can dominate through market projection, and versus the Prussian ideal of creating this global state that can be subsumed underneath their military hierarchy. And I guess that really sets the context of how Spengler sees the world and saw world history, and it ended up playing out exactly as he said in the Second World War, which shows that there's a lot of explanatory power to his way of viewing history.
Yeah, and just before we move on and elaborate on a lot of these ideas we're talking about, I just need to turn to the chat for a moment, because we have a few super chats and a few other non-super chat comments that I wanted to highlight. So, first, Agent Sixpack with $2 Australian. Prussianism and Neatism. Very nice. That's going to be a jab at socialism, I'd imagine. Then I got, $5 from Harambe in Guantanamo. How do you feel about the pedophilia openly proclaimed in Jewish scriptures, such as Sanhedrin 54b in the Talmud? I'm not a fan. Then we got, but thank you for the $5, appreciate it. And then we got $5 from the Margard. Who is this nice fellow, Tom? Is he your IRL BF or maybe just a friend? Please do a quick introduction of him. So yeah, Dick, a lot of people in the chat were wondering who you are. So maybe you would want to do a personal introduction if that is okay, instead of just coming at us and hitting us with that smooth voice without taking us to dinner first, if you get what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I decided that I would create this mythology of Dick Dickinson, let it kind of grow and become its own thing before I self-dox, which I plan on doing in the future. But nevertheless, I met Dylan through mutual online servers discussing esoteric philosophy, and then we realized we lived close by, and so hung out IRL a few times. And decided to collaborate on what we do on YouTube, which is discussing the ideas in these esoteric books and reactionary politics and metaphysics in general. And so here we are. I think we're planning to make this into a regular show, if the demand is there. Even if the demand isn't there, I think we're going to do it anyway because we enjoy it.
Yeah. Another person, Duffmatic, just says regularly, he just says, "You girls," just completely out of context, and I bet you that is a reference to Elliot Rodger, because that is just how in tune I am with the Supreme Gentleman up in the sky, so I just wanted to point that out and how kind of strange that is of me. And then, secondly, somebody says, well, ... the correct definition of socialism is the state owning and controlling the means of production, military, and wealth distribution. So this is kind of
a definition of socialism, but like you can create a word and give it whatever definition you want. So if you want to understand what someone means, rather than trying to change the definition of the words they use into definitions that they didn't intend, and obscuring the point that they were trying to make behind this veneer, instead we should try and understand what people mean by the words they say, so that we can actually understand what they're trying to express to us.
Right, so like a political structure, as it were, isn't how it exists in the most temporal and immediate state. It just because the Soviet Union today is not like communism, it doesn't, or like could even say just because like Leninist government in the history of the Soviet Union never reached a point that could sufficiently be said to have owned all of the means of production, and there was always a little bit of market liberalism like lingering somewhere, and it doesn't stop that underneath it all there was this mood, this instinct, this feeling, this attitude, this spirit that motivates socialism as a political structure in different corners of the world. Not saying that it is the same everywhere it shows itself, but if you're going to come in with these like rigid definitions that are completely unchanging and have no reference to any of the things actually underlying the institutions that creates them, then you're going to have like an extremely stagnant worldview, and you're not going to really be able to say much about anything. So yeah, but to move on,
I think on chapter 4 of this particular essay is on Marx, and Spengler basically just destroys Marx. He doesn't believe that it's possible for anyone but the Germans to do socialism properly, and he doesn't believe in the socialist ideals of, of kind of this proletarian revolution whereby goods and services can be distributed equally. That is not what he believes at all. He's actually extolling, as I said, a fascistic worldview, where he believes the productive capacity of society should be subordinated to the state for the benefit of the collective of the nation state, to extend its power and success and manifest its spiritual vision in the world. So he's pro-hierarchy. He states in this essay that he believes that the monarchist and the socialist ideal need to be unified. And he criticizes the German Revolution that occurred at the end of the First World War as being Marxist and infected with non-German ideas, which are not the true embodiments of socialism, which he believed would come later. And I think you look at National Socialism. I mean, Spengler was a reluctant supporter of it, and he thought, he believed in the necessity for German socialist necessity over the world to come in a similar form to National Socialism, but he thought that he had his reservations about the Nazi leadership, and he thought they would screw up the entire process. But I think you see in National Socialism something a lot closer to what Spengler was going for with his definition of socialism. Furthermore, he what's really potent is that he is a massive critic of democracy, and he sees to the English liberal that English liberalism is just a veneer, a justification for the dominance of its capitalist elites over the globe. And it's one form of imperialism, whereas he sees. And he sees Marxist socialism as a reaction to that, in the sense that the people who get exploited by this process want their share of the loot, whereas that's completely alien to the German socialist ideal, which is about preventing money power from taking over the world, essentially, and controlling the political system, and instead directing it towards the military and the state, so that
in a word, it's kind of like the Prussian idea of socialism isn't a socialism of wealth, like vis-a-vis the kind of Anglo brand of it, and like Marx as well, who was accused of being like an Anglo socialist by Spengler, and it's different from the socialism of class and social status as like vis-a-vis the French Revolution and the French brand of socialism. Instead, it is like a socialism of obedience to a greater totality of society, where class and hierarchy exists, but everybody is seen as being within this one organ of the state, as it were. But I kind of wanted to go back and unpack some of these ideas, and we were talking in the beginning, and just to like elaborate again, I think it would be important to talk about like one of the more specific foundations of Spengler's work that relates to this video. If you remember in my last video I made, Spengler's contention is that within each culture is this immutable principle that is like unique to that culture, and their beliefs are resultant from this, as opposed to anything that is like completely external and separate from itself. Within each society, there is this like set of beliefs, feelings, attitudes, sentiments, arts, physics, mathematics, the actions, and the general social structure and they're all brought to life by this different consciousness of the people comprising it. Like differences in cultures are differences in mankind, as Spengler puts it. And so history,
Yeah.
it isn't the tale of this singular man, but that of classical man, the Roman man, the Indian man, the Chinese man, the Western man, and so on. And so each culture, like it has this way of bringing human beings towards it from like whatever region or matter of geography that it presides over, and then it shapes them. So that is to say that we aren't the creators of culture, but the creatures of culture, which is a quote from Spengler, which I think puts it very succinctly. And so over time, the centuries roll by, the years start coming and they don't stop coming, as Smash Mouth said. Culture becomes, yeah, sorry, culture becomes the immediate apology. Culture becomes civilization, and yeah, and that's its end point. Civilization is the end point of culture. Culture is alive and robust, while civilization is mechanical, rigid, and cold.
Yeah.
And so, like, the spirit becomes material. Like, life is explained by political and economic factors. Ideas become imperialism, and so on. You sounded like you wanted to jump in there. Was there anything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I think the key thing to get is that Spengler doesn't see religion and philosophy as determinations of a ahistorical universal truth about being, but instead he sees them as expressions, like historical expressions of the relationship between the spirit of a people in a particular historical context and the reality that they face. And so um, the German worldview or the British worldview of the early 20th century and all of the philosophy and religion that embodies it, they're not competing universal truths. He sees them as true for those people in that time, and he sees the truth, the applicability of their truths to kind of global dominance as dependent on their capacity to win the wars and enforce their global dominance in the theater of war and conquest. And so, you know, when when Spengler is talking about the Germans or the British having the different competing ideas of a global order, the German being this world state, and the English being this, global capitalism, this global market that we kind of see today. What he sees is these are like unconscious processes that are in the spirit of these two nations that manifest unconsciously through the machinations of their great men and their institutions and their ideas, and that ultimately the truth, the necessity to create this universal truth is really just a rationalization or justification for whatever truth garners for itself global imperial dominance. So when you see like the Ben Shapiro's of this world and the other defenders of the status quo coming out in support of global markets and global democracy and so forth, like as if there's these abstract, philosophical truths that make these systems the best possible systems. What they're actually doing is just justifying the particular structure of power which dominates over the world today, whether you like it or not. That's all they're doing. Personally, and I think Dylan as well, even though we are ethnically Anglo, I think we both feel spiritually German. And I think this is part of Spengler's point, is that Faustian man has got these different sub-spirits and that they're available to us as authentic Faustians to choose for ourselves and feel ourselves into and embody in our lives, in our being. And I think particularly for the Americans in the audience, the amount of Germans that immigrated to America in the 19th century in particular has created this kind of massive German ethnic base in America. I believe there's more ethnic Germans than ethnic Brits in America. I'm not 100% sure if that's certain, but I know it's comparable. And so we can see kind of in the modern Anglosphere, there's this latent Germanness that's available to us because we, I guess, defeated them in two world wars and tried to integrate them into our structure. And I guess what we're saying here is that just because we defeated them in that particular war, and we have the current system that there is today, it doesn't mean that is it. That's the fatalistic worldview that we have to enforce as conservatives of the West. But there's actually the German ideal of what the West is that existed, and it might have fallen in the First and Second World Wars, but it still exists within us as a spirit, and is still available to us as a people. And I think that's kind of what the alt right is, and what kind of modern um, reactionary politics signifies, is this kind of reawakening of the German spirit within our people. And so I think that's very key to understand from this essay in particular really elucidates what that means.
Yeah, so someone in the chat says Smash Mouth is the last stand of implicit Prussian identity, which I thought, which I just wanted to read out. But yeah, so something that you kind of touched on there is like, so putting aside this idea of civilization as an artificial shell of what was once culture. You kind of talk about this idea of like philosophy and what the purpose of philosophy is, and there's these people that think they have these universal principles that are binding for all of mankind, but all they're really doing is rationalizing a certain way of life. Like they're uncovering the mind of whatever peoples they find themselves in, and then just projecting it outwards onto the world around them as if they were discovering some universal principle. And Spengler kind of puts it very well when he identifies the emergence of the Whig, you could call it, what my last video was especially focused on, as the emergence of this feeling of ripeness. That's like a good adjective that he uses. Like today we see ourselves as being like the end point of history. We see the West as the center of the solar system of time, and in a way we have this view that we are the ripest fruit of humanity, and the emergence of this cosmopolitan attitude is like the hallmark of decline, the transition from culture to pure civilization. So people like Rousseau, Socrates, Buddha, these all mark the downward trend in society, as opposed to like this enlightenment that they think themselves to represent. And they kind of mark the same point of juncture, those people I just listed, as like the Chomskys and the Frankfurt School and like the modern academic. And because they have no metaphysic fundamentally, and they're purely practical and uncultured. And a lot of this essay also gets into an idea, which I don't know how far we want to get into, of this, like, we'll get into it by necessity, but there's like a greater amount of literature that we don't have to get sidetracked on, about the transcendental universal principle as power. And like Nietzsche writes on this, and Spengler was obviously very much influenced by Nietzsche in many ways, and then Heidegger from the two as well. But a good example of this would be like imperialism in the modern era versus that of the past. If you look at Babylon, for instance, like its imperial conquest only got them as far as like the Near East and to the east of the empire, while the Greeks and the Romans were around like Europe and Britain, Mesopotamia, and probably like as south, like Africa-wise, as like the Sahara. Well, China's only got them to like the Caspian Sea area. But if you look at modern imperial powers like Britain, the United States, they possess the entire globe. Like there is no recognition of borders or limits. And like for instance, one example is obviously like including America as a part of Europe. But the whole world has had this like Americanized city planted within its nations, and like the whole native population is just completely subjected to it, this like caricature of Americanism. Like if you've ever gone to like the big cities of like third world countries, of like Korea, it's like this mimicry of Americanism that you see. Like they're trying to just poorly imitate this like very American lifestyle, this vision of like consumerism, of markets, of individualism, and in many ways anti-sociality.
Yeah, Heidegger calls that the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, you finish. What were you gonna say?
Well, Heidegger calls that the gigantic, and I think Spengler describes it as this Faustian drive toward infinite space. That who we are as a people is just this endless striving toward the infinite, which is why it's led us into space exploration and into like global conquest, and 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 so he posits that there's this kind of polarity between the Prussian and the English mentality of which way we want to go about it. Do we want to conquest the world as a business transaction, as a bunch of resources that can be extracted and then sold at a profit through the power of money, or do we want to conquest the world as a military, as a state, and extend our empire and bring the world underneath our control imperially? And and I think personally, I don't see any great value in this kind of capitalist globalism, which, as we can all see on the reactionary fringe, as being so destructive to our society, liquidating all of our values, our essence as a people, bring in multiculturalism and feminism and all these terrible ideas that are that fit so well with this kind of liberalist justification for global financial supremacy and economic supremacy, whereas the German ideal, rather than being, is more embodied in this idea of a kind of collective identity, a collective destiny, as opposed to this like egoic will to power as an individual of just getting for oneself a Ferrari and a mansion and living the high life, but instead as a people achieving a great world historical mission, a world historical destiny of dominance and supremacy. And I think that idea and the manifestation of all of the spiritual and metaphysical ideas that are embodied within our civilization to manifest a kind of divinely inspired order over the world. I personally see that as far more beautiful and inspiring. And so I'd much rather become part of that fight, that war, that ideal, than simply reduce myself to a sensuous ego, which is pursuing base pleasures and consumerism, which is the ultimately the English ideal. And so I think this adds a little bit more dimensionality to the alt-right's kind of criticism of the Jews in the triple parentheses, because whilst I recognize the negative effects that they recognize, I think also we have to look at the eternal Anglo meme a lot more closely.
Yeah, the Anglo question has been unexamined for too long. I just got some super chats. Her Hollandhund with £2. What do you think of the website jmaa.tv? I've never heard of it, but thanks for the donation. I appreciate it. And then I got Albert Scannell with 50 NOK. Hey Tom, I heard Justin Murphy is interested in doing a stream with you about Neo Reaction. I'll look it up. I'll get around to that. That sounds interesting. Yeah, so what we were talking about this idea of consumerism and markets. We got this so we got this vision of like markets and globalism, and it's seen as like transcendent, binding on all. Like in our thirst for world power, we have forced the rest of the world to like reduce themselves to the same materialist, economic, and political ideals. And so Spengler kind of actually calls this drive towards universalism modern socialism, which is contrasted by like a realer form of socialism that we will get into. And of course, like a normie mainstream type would see this as globalism naturally in our age. But like when Spengler was writing, he had this kind of contention that socialism, and I still think this to be true in some extent, but along very different lines than it was in the past. It's like the discourse of our age that every Westerner is fascinated by. But so like we can get into this, like the German Revolution is obviously like a big part of this. Socialism, when looked at through the lens of Spengler, like it's not seen as something of a primordial origin. It's not seen as like the culmination of history, as Marx put it, but it's like the political, social, and economic attitude of this like realist, uncultured, civilizational people that we find ourselves as today. And Spengler even goes as far to date like the end of Western culture occurring around 1800s, and he's very like confident with dating when things will happen, and he tends to be very right a lot of the time in like a very profound way. But he kind of puts forward that the general attitude of like the Germans kind of after the fall of Prussianism. It kind of takes place and can best be analyzed in the German Revolution in 1917. So should we begin to explore that, because that is obviously like a big contention of his book, and you can feel, sorry, the essay, and you can feel this like emotional frustration as he writes about it, because he believes it's so misunderstood and misdiagnosed.
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, Spengler sees ideas and philosophies and political and religious movements as essentially, generally speaking, unconscious manifestations of a spirit of a people. And the less conscious it is, often the more misguided it can be. And so he sees the German Revolution as a misguided application of Marxist and liberal tendencies in Germany, which he believed were alien, which are technically alien to their people, French and English and Jewish ideas, which don't belong, which aren't authentic manifestations of the Prussian spirit. But nevertheless, he did see the German Revolution as getting toward this socialist ideal, this rejection of money power, which he saw as eminently German, because the German does not see legitimacy in the elites of society being bankers and capitalists. The German wants a king, he wants a military, he wants an aristocracy, fundamentally, at his essence. Whereas, so he saw it as essentially this kind of hostile reaction to foreign ideas, but misguided and therefore just embodying other kind of foreign alien ideas. And he saw a coming future revolution which would correct that, which I guess you could really draw a massive analogy between. I mean, he wrote this 14 years before National Socialists came to power, so he's really kind of calling toward a future correction. And he drew this contradistinction with the English Revolution, which he saw as essentially the English expelling Prussian ideas of the authority of the church and the rigid hierarchical militaristic state, and creating a kind of stateless society where under which the merchants and so forth could gain leverage and power. And so that really kind of sums up, I think, for me what was pissing him off about the German Revolution, but at the same time,
another thing that has to be said is that he desperately wants to rescue socialism from the clutches of Marxism, and so for him, like, he brings up this quality that the left of his day has as like a point of contrast from what he sees as real socialism, and they kind of saw this event as like an epoch, like they saw. Like, it's a really brief and embarrassing moment in German history, like the 1918 or 1917 revolution, and it's similar, like how to today we see leftists like kind of LARP, where they'll see a superhero movie having like a minority as the main lead, and they see it as the beginning of this new age, and there's like this kind of common theme that goes back to Spengler's time, where socialism on the modern left is seen as the goal of mankind, when it really gets back to just like a temporal manifestation of attitudes unique to their place in history. And
like he believed like the way that the Russians or the Chinese or whoever else do, socialism. It's not truly socialism, because he didn't believe, he believed only the Germans were capable of doing true socialism.
Right,
and so again, I reiterate, the socialism that he's talking about is not the socialism we know. It's essentially fascistic.
So like some things, for instance, like he views the proletariat of like the modern socialist, like the post-Marxian socialist, as purely a literary concept, and it's like expressing itself only in words rather than reality. And in fact, he goes as far as to say it was only real as long as it was denied this notion of the proletariat. And this is something that's very observable today, even. It's similar to how much more vulgar ideas like the oppression Olympics, you'll hear conservatives call it, where people actively want to be, quote unquote, like oppressed because the denial of their ideal is what makes it real. You can put that as like a rhyme, which is to say that like Marx and the left are really just critics, but Spengler realizes that Marx And his successors, as we were just talking about, are just stepfathers of socialism. They have inherited something much older, stronger, and fundamental than just like a critique of a capitalist political system. And their ideas are not of ink, as Marx's would be, but of blood, he says. So from here, Spengler kind of goes on and examines German history to uncover the realer aspect of socialism that has been disserviced by the left. And he kind of goes on to start by saying that the Germans, they have this very like tragic character to them. Everyone has something to say about the Germans in history, and they are seen as kind of embarrassing. Like, they have this widespread sense of like political failure residing within them. And when you talked about like the German re-emerging in America, that's probably like its biggest point of juncture, is this sense of political failure. They're constantly like displeasured with each turn of events. They criticize, like, so when you talk about like being displeasured at each turn of events, this manifests itself in like the alt-right seeing every single political happening as just moving the political Overton window to the left. Like, there's no event, with the exception of like Trump, which was by no means celebrated, and as soon as he was elected, like, even alt-righters would go as far within his first few months of presidency to resort back to like we have a Zog president and all of these talking points. So the German is this character to Spengler that criticizes at the wrong time. Like, he relaxes when they should be on their feet. They're like more concerned with ideals rather than pragmatism, but at the same time they like lash out when they should be more contemplative. Just all these marks of like a political failure, and he sums up like so he kind of sums up the German as this like very, very tragic kind of character. And so constantly on the brink of like annihilation. Like, when every battle for the German is always between victory and like being utterly wiped off the map. Like, they always have an army up their arse, if you know what I mean. Like, even in their own internal affairs, like their revolts and all these times of economic desperation, they have like other empires constantly looking over them like vultures, just waiting to like send their armies towards them if they don't go well enough for them. Like, this is obviously the case with like the world wars, that like a lot of the typical like ally revision is that like Germany started through them just trying to go about their own like military affairs. And so this like German Revolution is a really embarrassing moment where there's this rise of this Marxist style proletariat. The home army had undergone a mutiny, and there's this mob led by vermin journalists who saw the power vacuum as just peak opportunity to assert themselves. And all the while, like, these true socialists, like the true Germans, were still on the military front or had been buried in like the mass graves of Europe. And kind of before we get on to like, I kind of just want to uncover like what is a true socialist according to Spengler. I just got another super chat. Autism is unstoppable. $20 Australian. Hey, fellow Abo, can't watch the stream, but keep up the good work. Thank you. It is very late for all the non-Abos. I definitely appreciate that $20 donation, man. And that means a lot. Thank you. But my fellow Abo here reminds me to tell all of the non-Australians that it is 2:30 a.m. right now. It is another cozy late night stream, or early morning stream. So excuse us if we're a little too cozy for you. But yeah, so Spengler has this idea of like true socialists, and you can turn to the party of people like August Bebel, like a socialist politician that served before World War One, and it's like a very different brand of socialism from what you see today. Like, it was one of like worker battalions, like they were disciplined and calm, and they wanted to go to war, they wanted to die for their beliefs, and that's like very much juxtaposed by what we know socialists as today to be like the vegetative, like overly comfortable, sheltered, young middle class suburbanite. That that's who we.
Yeah, well, we also see this. He saw the French and the British as having ideals of essentially wanting to enjoy the consumption that work brings, but that viewed work as something to be avoided. Whereas the Germans saw work as his duty, as something to as a responsibility that he wanted to take upon his shoulders in duty to his German identity and to his people. And so the German, or the Prussian socialist, he was not trying to simply work less for more money. He was simply not happy with serving capitalist elites as opposed to nationalist, you know, his national leaders, his sovereign, his military, his people. That's who he wanted to do his duty to, and the ideals of the German people, not simply the kind of what Adam Smith called the invisible hand of the market. It's this kind of chaotic economic element that empowers billionaires to exert, massive control over society simply because they can manipulate economic forces to their own benefit. And I have a lot of sympathy with that idea because it makes a lot of sense to me. There's got to be some kind of ideal, some kind of destiny, some kind of reason why I'm going to work my ass off. Like, there's got to be something I'm working for. And the British, it was simply get the state out of the way, and I'm working for myself to win and to see the world as booty and plunder and the object of my desires, and for me to dominate simply for egoic reasons. And
sees
and
the
I
world as booty, colonizes Africa. Sorry, I just throw that in there.
But yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to what Spengler's saying here. Even if you fall on the other side of the camp, I mean, you can really see how he draws this kind of distinction between the two people as being very potent, and it really does kind of account for the 20th century.
Dude, as you were saying that, someone literally with an anarchy symbol comes in and says anarcho-socialism is the only socialism. But yeah, so you described this like spirit of like the Prussian people, and Spengler's contention is like the spirit of this party, of like August Babel's party. This would die in like this battle of ideas fought on the battleground of like academia and newspaper offices. And so, in this like Russian revolution, this is like this point where you see Marxists and socialists like at odds with each other, like a division most people don't really think is possible in today's day and age. And so if we turn back to Spengler's view of culture, it follows that in a revolution, there's never like a single victor class as the Marxist revision would have. And this is obviously like a huge blowback for like the Marxist view of socialism, because the true victor in Spengler's eyes is going to be blood. Like an idea, because of this system of history we've laid out, it becomes flesh and spirit. Like the victors of the French Revolution, for instance, they called themselves bourgeoisie. But from then onwards, Spengler would say that every true Frenchman was a bourgeoisie, and every true German, likewise, is a worker. But so yeah, there's like this huge like part of the literature.
He rejected.
Yeah.
He rejected the Marxist analysis of dividing society up into bourgeois and proletariat,
right,
as essentially
struggle.
Only describing. Yeah, well, he determined that as only really representing Britain, because of course, if you read Capital, Marx is describing industrial 19th century Britain. He's not describing Germany.
Yeah, we just got a quick super chat, $2 from Fanhead. V admitted he was bisexual on his last stream. Thanks for that. I don't know if you know who V is, but he is like one of Sargon of Akkad's like buddies in like the skeptic battle against the alt-right.
That Romanian.
Yeah. But yeah, so like like if you look at like the French, they're like really the archetype of the revolution in European history. They symbolize this like perfect, bloody, like sadistic revolution where there's these crazed masses and they join in this singular outcry. And Spengler believes that the German Revolution was just like a shitty imitation of that. Like the French showed us like what a proletariat revolution looked like in the face of like enemy artillery in 1871, and they had done so on other occasions as well. But the British as well, like they have their own style of revolution where they take like their sword and pistol and decapitate kings. Like they have manners at the dinner table. Like it's this like ritualized symbol of beheading the sovereign. And so, like, you can kind of see the English, like, they and this is almost like a parallel with the work ethic that you described. Like the English love the goal, the end result of the revolution, but they couldn't really care about like how the revolution comes about. While the French love the means, like they love impaling the aristocrats, killing the priests, but they don't give a fuck about what actually comes after the revolution. They just want to revolt. Um, but the Germans in this revolution, they just desired gossip. Like they didn't actually have this process of revolution undergo. It was just like the same vegetative, like second-rate political class, just wanting to feel important about themselves. And so Spengler like goes on to really vent his frustration with this. Because first, like, it was literally like unfolding in his time as he was like writing a lot of this. But the greater point is also to like highlight the differences between the peoples by looking at each of the revolution, like the English Revolution, the French Revolution, and the German Revolution. Like these aren't just to uncover 3 points on this like same linear progression towards like democracy, liberalism, like human rights. That's like the Anglo like I don't mean to like pin that on Anglos, but it's like the modern revision of it. But instead, these like 3 great Western revolutions, they separate 3 minds instead, and they all set out to achieve like liberty, equality, and brotherhood, like the you know the 3 typical virtues of any revolution. But ultimately, each one of these, like the Britons, Germans, French, would express these things in extremely different ways that corresponded to their own way of life. Like the English obviously expressed it via liberalism, which is like highly reflective of this like commerce-based people that they emerged from, and the French chose like this French style of democracy where like anyone having power is seen as an injustice, like this kind of anarchic view of democracy. But neither, like as you brought up, like neither had anything to do with like this class struggle as Marx would have thought. That's like one of the ultimate failures of Marx, is like how ridiculously materialistic he is. Like there was definitely class involved in like the social sense with the French specifically, but in contrast to these, where you have liberalism and this like French style democracy, the Prussians, they had their own belief that kind of goes back to how their brand of socialism is so unique, and that is one that saw power as something that ought to belong to the totality, not to the proletariat, and so on. So like you had this organ of society where each citizen is assigned their place and the king is at the top. There's this hierarchy, but the hierarchy is within the totality. And so this is the socialism that Spengler is actually referring to, this German socialism. It is socialism, but not of status or economic class, but it's this socialism of power, and it is non-liberal and it deeply authoritarian in nature, and it's also uniquely anti-revolutionary, which goes back to like the kind of government that you said that it kind of parallels to, which I might end up on Right Wing Watch if I say, if you honest. Yeah, before we continue, like I think there's a lot in this essay to talk about which we still haven't covered on like English liberalism, which I really like. But I got $5 Australian, all the Aussies tonight, all the boys at 2:30 a.m. Lachlan, $5 Australian. Can you do a video on National Socialism sometime in the future? Yeah, potentially. I mean, it's definitely like an extremely important moment in modern history. So yeah, sure. Nozenyaga, £5. The modern social... I keep saying pounds when I mean to say euros. The modern social system of Austria evolved out of the Austro-Hungarian and was always duty-driven. Mass immigration transformed it into socialism. Sure, I understand what you were saying. Like what the German socialist means today when he says it is this like degenerative version of what it once meant, and what it would come to mean.
It's not even the same thing.
It's not the same thing, and also, like as you were saying, what it would come to mean was fascism. But yeah, so if we keep moving forward, like if we talk about like English liberalism, I think that's like definitely a what does Spenglers have to say about liberalistism? I don't know if you were paying attention to that, but like with the whole Sargon thing, after he got like wrecked by Richard Spencer on that debate, he went and like in his insecurity, in his brokenness, he made like a website declaring himself as like the leader of a new ideological movement, and he called himself a liberalist, which of course the noun is like liberalistism. Uh, but yeah, but if we turn to Sargonism, if we turn to English liberalism and their parliamentary system, like that type of system, it this is like another point of difference between like Germans and the English. There's this two strong personalities, two parties that are like mutually complementary. Like the state's kind of like divided into two parties, and the Prussians saw this as like it's like being led by political opposition. It's like serving a government that doesn't exist. And there's a passage, like I'm reading the Bible. There's a there's a part in the essay where he describes it like the parliamentary system as if you have like a schoolroom where the teacher is away. There's no like unified political process, and I think that's a very good way of putting it. And like this liberal English state of like the 18th and the 19th century, it's pretty much like a complete abstraction. Like it doesn't actually have like a single tangible claim on the English citizen. Like it doesn't assign him to any role in this like greater political construct.
That's the whole point.
Yeah. So like during the 19th century, like England has no compulsory education, no like compulsory military service, no compulsory social security. It's like a libertarian paradise, really. So like England just replaces the state with this notion of the private citizen, and what Spengler argues is that like this old Norse instinct, the Viking instinct for piracy and clever trading, like that lives on in the English attitude towards property, like work, like weaker individuals, and it offers its own strategy for power because of which like enables billionaires to like rule over foreign weaker nations, like shitholes, if you will. But the German, as you pointed out, like they don't have this inner Viking living inside them. They're more like the knight that sees themselves as like not only a literal crusader but like a moral crusader fighting for like an ethical cause. And so the German liberal, like they're kind of just summed up as saying just no to authority, if you get what I'm saying. And they don't actually have anything to replace it. Like they're not actually manifesting like the destiny of this spirit that lives within them. They're just like
Basically, like Spengler's admitting that the Germans are like autistic moralizers who take shit too seriously, where like the British can be liberals but still justify like a global capitalist hegemony, and that's what it's for. It's a front, a justification to make them feel better and ethically justify what they're doing to themselves. Whereas for the German who becomes a liberal, like they try and take liberalism seriously, and obviously, as we know, if you take liberalism seriously, you end up becoming self-destructive because it's an incoherent ideology. It's designed purely to act as a kind of facade, as a justification for capitalist dominance, and so like for the German to take something seriously has to be something that is natural to himself, which is this kind of reactionary idea. The Germans as a people were the kind of holdouts against modernity. You see this in German Romanticism, in German idealism, all of German philosophy and art and literature. You see this kind of common thread of the German trying to retain his connection to tradition and retain his connection to the state and to religion in a kind of authentic manner. And this is completely juxtaposed with the British rejection in their philosophy and in their kind of culture of tradition and the embrace of fashion and causality and sensuousness. And so it's just completely alien to the Germans. So as we can see today, like the confused nature of like the German leadership of the EU with their kind of confused liberal ontology, self-destructing Europe. This is what happens when you impose a British or American justification for capitalist dominance onto the German people. You get this very confused, self-destructive outgrowth because they're people of destiny. They're a people of identity, and so they take their moral beliefs seriously.
Yeah, so like the German liberal, as it were, in Spengler's time, is just seen as like ignorant of historical necessity, like this antisocial, uncooperative, pseudo-intellectual with this ideology that's like just perfect for the ivory tower scholar or the cut off from the rest of the world, and because of which can only like deal with abstractions. And like it should also be said that this isn't to like criticize liberalism in this moment. Like we can, you know, do plenty of that elsewhere. It's just to say that like English liberalism has unified the English in a way that's like unable to be replicated elsewhere. Like the English of like the 19th century are joined together in this like very respectable society. Like despite being very liberal, they're a class of ladies and gentlemen, and they're just unified around this like common interest of and feelings and thoughts and behaviors. Like the empire facet of Britain, which was like a big virtue to like Prussians, was just background noise to like the internal goings on of the nation. So you know, the English being very motivated by success and good fortune, like they're very contrasted by this Prussian like poets and thinkers, and there's this personality that sees like wealth as the ultimate virtue and models society around like a club or a banquet in England that is just totally un-German. And this is why liberalism won't work in Germany, according to Spengler, because there isn't a device for cultural solidarity, while there is one in England. And I just got 2 super chats that I want to read. I got one by Mitch, which is now £5, not euros, pounds. It's ya boy, looking good, Dylan. Loving the casual look. Thank you very much, Mitch. Mitch is a friend of the show. Then we got Fanhead. Sorry, I just skipped your thing. English monarchy is ethnically German. Thoughts?
Oh, well, that's a good point to bring up, because as Spengler describes, the English Revolution was fundamentally a rebellion against the Prussian mentality in Britain. Like, so the power of the monarchy and the power of the aristocracy to make way for the power of the kind of Viking capitalists.
Right.
So that's a very good point. Obviously, the Anglo-Saxons and we're Germanic. We're a Germanic people. We're one race. We're one ethnicity. But nevertheless, there is this distinctness between the German spirit and the English spirit, which is the Anglo-American spirit. And I think we can see that play itself out in dynamic form throughout in modern history.
Someone, I got another $5 from Irish Cream saying, make a video about Mason and Siege and its effect on our movement. Like, I occasionally, when I feel like being really lazy with a video and just like I'm reading something and I just want to like literally relay that, I'll do a video series called Let's Read. Excuse me. And yeah, so sure thing, next video, Let's Read Siege. Anyway, moving on. The Prussians, like, we have this idea of like the Prussian man, like he's rank conscious, and the society has this like ethos of work that unites them. Like they feel obliged to sacrifice themselves for others, like to work in a way that benefits the collective. The virtue of the land isn't wealth, it's rank, unlike the Brits. And they are not this race of businessmen, but they're this race of workers. And as you said earlier, which is a good point to bring up again, is that work is valued in and of itself, as opposed to like a means to an end. And like there's this idea in the British mentality that hopefully you work and you become rich, and then you never have to work again. And this is important to bring up when we turn to Marx again, because like firstly, there's a good point that Spengler makes, which is very interesting, and he talks about how this displays itself in the outfits of England and Germany. And you brought up earlier that like the English were obsessed with fashion, and so you have this difference in dress that highlights like a lot about the underlying mentality of the two populations. So the Germans, they were all eager to be public servants and to serve the totality of the country, and so they would proudly display their Prussian uniforms, having all types of success shown off by the wearing of a uniform that corresponds with your duty to society. So, but in England, none of the nobility wear uniforms. Like, it's a unique thing for like the like to see like British aristocracy they just walk around in suits. They wear these like individualized suits, and this was the uniform of the private individual. And this uniform, like to go back to the point about power, is also like an expression of uniform thinking. Like there's no right to be illiberal in like the liberal mindset. Like the liberal will sniff you out no matter what corner of the globe you're hiding in, and he'll bring liberalism to you. And so like the anti-utilitarian nature of Germans, uh, this also, like you brought up, parallels in the history of ideas, like with Kant, and his contempt for happiness and his categorical imperative of duty. But if we turn to the English philosophers instead, which we haven't brought up yet, they're dominated by this utilitarianism. Instead of do that which you will to be law for all, like vis-a-vis Kant, they say just do that which gives you the most happiness, the most success. And so, like, to Spengler, the Englishman is this, like, lone utilitarian, like, standing in Europe on his little island of Britain. And when we see, like, the English people as structured along the lines of wealth and poverty, and the Prussian along the lines of command and obedience, we see Marx as, like, better embodying, like, this sort of Anglo-socialism, like a liberal socialism, or in many ways, like, the injustice of capitalism to Marx really boils down to, like, the unequal redistribution of wealth.
You're like, give me more stuff, basically.
Yeah, like
more shackles.
And that doesn't abide by like the German conception of struggle, but the English formula for like the proletariat. People like George Bernard Shaw, like and other British, like he was Irish, socialist political activists. Like they fall into this sort of like capitalistic socialism, where the questions of the good life are just answered identically to like how the individualist capitalist would answer them. It is better to be rich than good. Like this kind of sentiment, like the worker struggle to Marx can really boil down to the struggle of just not being rich, and this is why there is like no proletarian socialism in England, and it's because it's only ever like socialism in England has only ever manifested itself as pretty much like a form of lower class capitalism, in a way. And so
if you take it's like from a Nietzschean perspective, it's essentially just ressentiment, just
right,
the hatred of the powerful by the inferior,
like the feeling of being pushed down by the capitalist class and unable to push back up.
Yeah, where the Prussian idea is essentially it's a positive valuation of power and supremacy. It's just simply wanting to position it within the context of a destiny, of a shared spiritual ideal, to collectivize an identity around, as opposed to just playing like creating this chaotic economic system, and like whichever person happens to become a billionaire and amass the greatest number of shekels wins, which is just vapid and baseless.
And so like there's this mentality, like whether, for instance, like even when it comes to compensation, like the Germans were much more, they saw compensation not as about wealth or about wages, but about rank. And so like the English were so unable to understand this that like they were not poor during their strikes, and they actually accepted like hundreds of thousands of pounds offered to them by German workers who supported their cause under the impression they were fighting the same battle as they were. And there's also like a lot of people kind of angry about, because there's like a lot of Brits watching this, and like I got nothing against you Brits. I am, but I think we're both like ancestrally British, as it were. We're like the mutt counter, like not the mutt, like the prison colony counterpart. But yeah, so that's like I think he makes some like very good points about liberalism, and something that like emerges, although I can't remember if he specifically brings it up, is this idea of like the economic myth. Like from this, you can really see how like two non-Anglosphere mythos, and it's a mythos of economics. Like the English have always had their own like crude psychology, obviously, that's been very much not really paralleled with like other places of the world and what they could produce psychology wise. And they've thought this to also be binding to all of mankind again, so they're projecting this notion that like economic life is all about like business, like in every facet of the globe. And Marx's effort to deny like the Manchester School of Economics, like it would just result in him simply paralleling it. Like both of them, in terms of Manchester and Marx, predicted that like when the worlds went to war and people like disengaged from this business cycle, that the world economy would just completely collapse. But nonetheless, like the English were the first to formulate their own economic activity just as they were ascending to be like the greatest empire in the world at the time. And so their ideas would see the same imperial spirit manifest within them. And so like within the ideas, they would have this same imperial longing for power come to fruition. And so the statement man is like an amoral and rational being is really just like a statement of Anglos only who are happy to like succeed at the expense of others, while like the Prussian isn't, which is like a perfect example of like an amoral but rational person. So England would kind of succeed in, how Spengler puts it, like poisoning all countries to which it has offered this like medicine of liberalism, but it's really just its own form of government and its own mode of imperialism in doing so, if you get what I'm saying. I just got to.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to read a quick super chat from Eyes of Frozen Meat, $5. Nice username. Thank you for the donation. There's a big ass True Dill Tom sticker on a busy traffic light in the middle of California's Bay Area. Interesting. You should send me a photo of that on Twitter or something. I'd like to see that. And then Gondola with his 500 N. Okay, I actually don't know how much that is because I don't know like that currency very well, but I'll look it up so I can thank you. 85 Australian. I'm just had to count the shekels real quick. Thank you very much, Gondola. Gondola is a big friend of the show. Obviously, always has been. Each people. Oh, sorry. I think that's like a. Oh no, that's just that. Okay, each people, its culture and reproductive strategies. Very insightful. What were you gonna say though, Dick Dickinson? Made sure to not dox you just then. It almost came off my tongue, but I
don't really. If it happens by accident, I give a shit. But yeah, I think the key to understand, like for all those like latent libertarians out there, if any of you are listening, is to understand that these are the German ideal and the British ideal, whatever you think of them, are competing global imperial ideologies, or ways of the Faustian civilization has become, or the Western civilization has become, the dominant culture of the world and has brought the entire world under itself in subordination. And so we've created globalization. We've connected the world for the first time and integrated it into a cohesive political economic system. There's no going back. And so the question becomes, how do we run it? Now, we've been running it under the kind of British capitalist liberal model ever since the end of the Second World War. And look at the complete disaster that befalls us. What has happened is Anglo-American corporations and banks have attained great wealth and global supremacy, but at the cost of retaining our political and cultural order as a people. And because liberalism opens itself up to these things, it does not care about preserving or manifesting a kind of spiritual or metaphysical destiny and projecting that order onto the world and enforcing it. It simply cares about projecting its power as economic individualistic units. So as Spengler describes, we can't just forget all of our history and act as ahistorical beings. True power comes from harnessing the historical inertia that comes behind us and becoming a living embodiment of truly the time and place and history that we are. And so we have to take stock of the history that's behind us and become an embodiment of this moment and this time in world history. And so we can go along with this kind of capitalist degeneration, this liberal degeneration and liquidation of our people and culture and civilization, and just consume in the decline, or we can try and reach back out to the destiny, the alternative vision, this collective identity, the spirit of our people, and bring back and manifest all the great philosophical and religious and spiritual and artistic innovations of the last 1,000 or so years that our people have created, and bring about a kind of a global empire which actually reflects our destiny and our uniqueness and our exceptionalism and our supremacy as a people. And it's up to us which side of the coin we want to fall upon. But they're the only two sides of the coin that we can fall upon, because this is what history has presented to us as a dichotomy.
Someone said that the yellow coat said the Australian spirit is the eternal struggle against the emu, which and so it's like, rest in peace, brave soldiers who died in the Emu War. Never forget. It's kind of funny that the Emu War has like the American, like, Burger resigned, like, calling card, you know. But yeah, so we've been going on for about an hour and 20 minutes now. I'm definitely starting to crash, as it is 3 a.m. But you know, that was a really good stream. I'm glad my computer didn't crash like last time. Is there anything else you wanted to go on? Like, we could, you know, I'm happy to entertain like a whole other topic if you want to bring it up, but or do you want to just end it here?
No, I'm happy to end it.
All right, sweet. Yeah, so thanks for listening, everybody. This was a great fun. This was a much more coherent stream than the last one. It went much better than I thought it did, because I only just read this essay at I started reading it at 7 p.m. or so. So just like a few hours ago. But we got a lot out of it. I really liked it. Spengler's like easily one of my favorite authors. He just fascinates me, and you kind of have this whole understanding that you only really had glimpses of and suspicions and inklings, but it comes together as like a full system that kind of goes back.
He's a very powerful thinker.
Yeah.
I think we should do more discussions in the future on Spengler's Decline of the West proper, which we're both working through at the moment. Maybe Spengler's kind of view of democracy in general is quite a good one. He absolutely destroys it in his writings. And that could be fun to talk about, as well as just his view of history in general. And I think it would be a good point to like progress from into Heidegger, if you're interested.
Oh, yeah.
Heidegger was very influenced by Spengler's ideas.
The Pakistani reactionary is reading Heidegger now, and I definitely thought we could have a guest feature on this with the Pakistani reactionary. And I know you're like much further ahead than us with Heidegger, but yeah, 100%. That would be a great thing to cover as well. Also, just it's also good to like we could ramp up the frequency with these by doing essays. You know, like it's always good to just introduce like a brief idea instead of always unfolding these huge works that need like constant reference to different points in your explaining of it to get a full picture of, if you get what I'm saying.
Like Decline of the West is just a massive document, which is why I think in the future, if we do talks on it, we should pick maybe a few things from it and just talk about those, an aspect of it, because to cover the whole thing we'd need to do like 30 streams. It'd be ridiculous. So.
Yeah. But yeah, so thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back soon, as well as my regular content, and you'll see Dick Dickinson emerge with his own channel, hopefully, with a different name, and then I'll probably just start calling you that, unless you want to call me Dick. If you want me to call you Dick, still. But you know, hope you guys enjoyed the Dick tonight as he goes by. But yeah, I got another €2 from Nosenjager with Tolkienism went. There's a lot of Germans. I don't know if you were German, but like a lot of German names coming up when we were doing this stream, and I'm sure they were probably loving it, because this was like a very pro-German account of socialism, if you get what I'm saying. But yeah, thanks for the donation. I very much appreciate it. But I'll end it here. I have more sympathy for Tom's crashed computer than all of you. Alright, that's just the last comment. But anyway, guys,
didn't crash this time.
Yeah, that was good. That was great. That was fantastic. I'm stoked about that. But I was thinking about it a lot, like while you were speaking. I was like, oh no, it's gonna fucking like, I bet you as soon as it comes to my mind it's gonna happen, but it didn't happen. Maybe that's it, I jinxed it. But anyway, guys, catch you later. Austrian, my man. Oh, cool. Very cool. Catch you later, guys. Have a good one. I just joined. Alright. Laters.